She walked onto my property like she already owned it. A woman in a navy blazer with an HOA pin. No clipboard. No documents, just the kind of certainty that comes from years of never being questioned. Behind me stood Whitfield Manor. 3 stories of Queen Anne Victorian I'd spent 6 months restoring. I bought this house to save it, to bring 130 years of history back to life. Now this woman, Grace Brown, claimed the mansion belonged to her HOA, that I was trespassing on my own land. Her eyes lingered too long on the parlor windows, too familiar with rooms she'd never been invited into. That's when I knew this wasn't about community property. This was about how far someone will go when they believe inheritance is stronger than a deed. She was wrong, and I had the paperwork to prove it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. My name is Elaine Mercer. I'm a historic preservation architect, 15 years of saving buildings that most people would tear down. When you spend your career researching deed chains and fighting bureaucracies to protect structures worth preserving, you recognize fabricated authority the moment it walks onto your property. The woman crossing my front lawn carried herself like someone who'd never been questioned. Her name was Grace Brown, HOA president for 9 years, and she was about to make the worst miscalculation of her life. The mansion behind me, Whitfield Manor, built in 1892, had been abandoned for 15 years when I found it. Roof leaking, porch rotting, windows shattered by vandals and Virginia winters. But the bones were extraordinary. Original crown moldings intact. Heart pine floors beneath decades of neglect. Stained glass in the parlor that had somehow survived everything. I'd spent 6 months and most of my savings bringing it back to life. Every permit is filed correctly. Every restoration decision is documented. So, when Grace Brown announced that it belonged to her HOA, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear, but the focused clarity that comes before a fight you know you're going to win. This property is historical common land, Grace declared, gesturing at the mansion like a prosecutor presenting stolen evidence. It was donated to the community in 1987. Whatever transaction you believe you completed is invalid. You need to cease all construction immediately and vacate the premises. Her voice carried rehearsed confidence, the cadence of someone who'd delivered this speech before. Maybe to previous owners. Maybe to anyone who'd questioned her. The 2 board members behind her stood silent, providing an institutional backdrop without substance. None of them held a single document. That told me everything about the strength of their position. I climbed down from my ladder slowly, using the silence to study her face. Early 60s, careful grooming, the kind of woman who controlled school boards and charity galas through sheer force of certainty. But her eyes betrayed something the polished exterior couldn't hide. She kept glancing at the parlor windows with recognition. Not curiosity, like someone returning to a room they hadn't seen in decades. "Do you have documentation to support that claim?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "A deed transfer, a recorded donation, anything filed with the county recorder's office?" Grace's smile tightened. "The HOA has maintained records of this property's status since our founding. I'll have legal counsel send you the relevant materials." I nodded slowly. "I'd welcome that. In the meantime, I have my own records. The deed I received at closing, title insurance confirming clear ownership, building permits issued by Fauquier County for every aspect of this restoration. I let each item land separately, all of which indicates I own this property outright, with no encumbrances, no liens, and no claims from any homeowners association." Something flickered behind Grace's composure, not doubt. She was too practiced for doubt, but recognition that she'd encountered resistance where she'd expected collapse. The man behind her shifted uncomfortably. Grace recovered within seconds. "Paperwork can be forged. Titles can be disputed. I've been part of this community for 40 years. Ms. Mercer, I know the county commissioners. I know the Historical Preservation Board. I know the local press." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You're an outsider who purchased something you don't understand. Don't force me to educate you about how things work here. I held her gaze without blinking. Mrs. Brown, I appreciate you sharing your position, but I won't stop legally permitted restoration work based on a verbal claim with zero supporting documentation. If your counsel has evidence that supersedes my recorded deed, I'm prepared to review it through proper channels. Until then, this is private property. I paused, and you're standing on it without invitation. The temperature between us dropped. Grace's manufactured warmth vanished, replaced by something colder and more honest, the look of someone who'd identified an obstacle and was already calculating how to remove it. "You're making a serious mistake," she said quietly. Then she turned and walked toward the silver Mercedes parked at the end of my driveway, her companions trailing behind her like attendants following a queen. That evening, I spread my closing documents across the dining room table. Deed chain from 1892 to present continuous ownership. No gaps, no donations, no transfers to any community organization. Title search clean, survey accurate. I'd reviewed these documents a dozen times before closing. But something caught my attention now that I'd overlooked before. The original family name on the 1892 deed, Whitfield. The family who'd built this house, who'd lived here for 3 generations before losing it to bank foreclosure in 1978. I opened my laptop and searched the HOA's archived newsletters. There it was, a community profile from 6 years ago. Grace Brown. Maiden name before marriage, Whitfield. I sat back and stared at the water-stained ceiling I hadn't yet restored. Grace wasn't just an HOA president with a power complex. She was a descendant of the family who'd built this house and lost it 46 years ago. This wasn't about community property or historical preservation. This was about reclaiming something she believed was stolen from her bloodline. And if she was willing to fabricate ownership claims in front of witnesses, I needed to understand exactly how far her obsession reached. I closed the folder and reached for my phone. Tomorrow, I'd visit the county recorder's office. Tonight, I'd start building the case that would end Grace Brown's 40-year delusion. The cease and desist letter arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail with the kind of theatrical formality designed to intimidate people who don't understand legal procedure. I do understand legal procedure. I've navigated historic preservation bureaucracies in 12 states, fought zoning boards, and challenged demolition orders. A letter on expensive letterhead doesn't scare me. But this one interested me because whoever drafted it had made a critical mistake. The document demanded I halt all construction within 72 hours or face immediate legal action for trespass and destruction of community heritage property. It was signed by someone named Harold Westbrook, identified as legal counsel for Oakwood Estates, HOA. The letterhead included a Virginia bar number. I wrote it down and opened my laptop. The Virginia State Bar maintains a searchable database of all licensed attorneys. I entered Harold Westbrook's name and the bar number from the letter. No results. I tried variations, different spellings. The number alone. The name alone. Nothing. Harold Westbrook either didn't exist or wasn't licensed to practice law in Virginia. Grace Brown hadn't just sent me a threatening letter. She'd fabricated an attorney to sign it. That elevated this from aggressive HOA behavior to something that looked increasingly like fraud. I photographed the letter, saved the search results, and added both to a folder I'd started labeling Brown Documentation. Then I drove to the Fauquier County Recorder's office. The county recorder is where property ownership becomes real. Deeds, liens, easements, transfers, everything that determines who owns what gets filed here and becomes part of the public record. I requested the complete deed chain for Lot 1, original Whitfield Estate, along with the grantor-grantee index showing every transaction involving that parcel since its creation. The clerk, a patient woman named Dorothy, who'd clearly dealt with property disputes before, pulled the records within 20 minutes. I spread them across a research table and began the systematic review I'd been trained to do. The deed chain was unbroken. 1892 original patent from the Commonwealth of Virginia to Samuel Whitfield. 1923 transfer to Samuel Whitfield, Jr. 1951 inheritance to Margaret Whitfield Hayes. 1978 foreclosure sale to First National Bank of Virginia. 1979 sale to Commonwealth Investment Partners. 2008 sale to Heritage Restoration LLC. 6 months ago sale to me. Every link documented. Every transfer recorded. No donation to any community organization. No transfer to any HOA. No mention of Oakwood Estates anywhere in 132 years of property history. Grace Brown's claim wasn't just unsupported, it was flatly contradicted by the official record. But the plat maps told an even more interesting story. When Oakwood Estates was developed in 1985, the subdivision plat specifically excluded Lot 1 from HOA jurisdiction. The notation was clear: parcel excluded from homeowner association governance per original deed restrictions. The Whitfield family had lost the house 7 years before the HOA existed, but whoever owned it at the time had ensured it would never fall under association control. Grace had built her empire around a property she had no legal authority over and had apparently spent decades pretending otherwise. I made copies of everything, thanked Dorothy, and drove to the office of Daniel Reeves, a title attorney whose name I'd gotten from my closing agent. Reeves reviewed my documentation with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen property disputes destroy families. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and delivered his assessment. "Ms. Mercer, you have what we call a quiet title. Your ownership is recorded, uncontested, and backed by title insurance. The HOA has no jurisdiction over your property. The plat maps make that explicit. If they continue making claims or sending threatening correspondence, you're looking at harassment, potentially fraud." He handed back my folder. "I'd recommend sending a formal response documenting your ownership and warning them that further contact will be referred to the county sheriff and the State Bar Association." I drafted that letter the same evening, attaching copies of the deed chain, the plat map exclusion, and my screenshot proving Harold Westbrook wasn't a licensed Virginia attorney. I sent it certified mail. Return receipt requested, keeping copies of everything. Then I waited. 3 days passed with no response. I allowed myself to hope that documentation had been enough, that Grace had recognized her position was indefensible and chosen to retreat. That hope lasted exactly 72 hours. The first violation notice appeared on day 4. Unauthorized exterior modification referring to the porch restoration I'd permitted 6 months ago. Day 5 brought another noise ordinance violation during hours when I'd been grocery shopping 30 miles away. Day 6, historical preservation infraction reported to the county, claiming I was destroying original architectural features I'd actually spent $14,000 restoring. Grace couldn't take the house through fabricated legal claims, so she was shifting tactics, building a harassment campaign designed to bury me in complaints until I either surrendered or ran out of money to fight. I photographed each notice, documented the timestamps, cross-referenced them against my own records, proving their falsity. Then I called the County Historical Preservation Office and requested a formal inspection, not because I needed one, but because I wanted official documentation that my work met every applicable standard. If Grace wanted a paper war, I'd give her one. The difference was that my papers told the truth. The inspection was scheduled for the following Tuesday. What I didn't know yet was that Grace had already made her next move, one that would reveal exactly how far her obsession extended. The county historical preservation officer arrived Tuesday morning in a white government sedan, clipboard in hand, expression professionally neutral. His name was Martin Cho, and he'd been doing this job long enough to recognize the difference between legitimate concerns and weaponized complaints. I could tell by the way he surveyed the exterior before knocking, methodical, unhurried, already forming conclusions based on what he could see. The porch I'd rebuilt using period-appropriate materials and documented techniques. The windows I'd restored rather than replaced. The original clapboard siding I'd carefully repaired instead of covering with vinyl. By the time he reached my front door, Something in his posture had already shifted from investigator to ally. "Ms. Mercer, I'm here regarding a complaint filed with our office," Martin began, consulting his clipboard. "The report alleges unauthorized modifications to a historically significant structure and destruction of original architectural elements." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "I should tell you the complaint also claims this property belongs to the Oakwood Estates HOA and that you're conducting unpermitted work on community land." Bo. I invited him inside and spent the next 90 minutes walking him through every aspect of the restoration. Permits filed with Fauquier County, material specifications matching the Secretary of the Interior standards for historic rehabilitation, photographic documentation of conditions before and after each phase. Original architectural elements I'd preserved at considerable expense when replacement would have been cheaper. Martin examined everything with professional thoroughness, asking questions that revealed genuine expertise. When we finished, he closed his clipboard and delivered his assessment. "Your work doesn't just meet standards, it exceeds them. This is one of the most carefully documented restorations I've reviewed in 15 years. He paused, something shifting behind his professional demeanor. "Ms. Mercer, I need to tell you something off the record. This isn't the first complaint we've received about this property. Someone has been calling our office for months, always anonymous, always making claims about HOA ownership and unpermitted construction. We investigated twice before you even started major work and found nothing actionable." He glanced toward the windows. "Whoever is doing this has an agenda that goes beyond legitimate preservation concerns." I thanked him for his candor and watched him drive away, adding his informal disclosure to the pattern I'd been assembling. Grace wasn't just harassing me directly, she'd been laying groundwork for months, possibly years, building a narrative of violation and trespass that she could deploy against whoever owned this house. The question was why. The foreclosure had happened in 1978. 46 years ago. What kind of obsession sustained itself across nearly half a century? The answer came that afternoon, in the last place I expected to find it. The basement had been on my restoration list since closing, but structural priorities had kept me focused on the upper floors. Water damage, electrical systems. The roof threatened to collapse if I didn't address it immediately. The basement could wait, or so I'd thought. That Tuesday afternoon, I finally descended the narrow stairs with a flashlight and a notebook, planning to assess what needed to be done. What I found instead was a time capsule. Boxes of documents had been left behind by previous owners, accumulated across decades, forgotten in the transition from one sale to the next. Most contained nothing remarkable: old utility bills, tax receipts, correspondence about mundane repairs. But one box, pushed into a corner beneath a collapsed shelf, held something different. A manila folder, water-stained but legible, labeled HOA Formation Whitfield Property. Inside was a document dated 1986, 1 year after Oakwood Estates was established. Declaration of Intent to Acquire, drafted by Grace Whitfield Brown, then a newly elected board member, outlining a plan for the HOA to purchase Lot 1 and convert it into community property. The language was specific fundraising targets, acquisition timeline, and proposed uses for the mansion as a community center. But the document had never been executed. The property was owned by Commonwealth Investment Partners at the time, and attached correspondence showed they'd declined the HOA's offer. The asking price was beyond what the association could raise. Grace's plan had failed before it began, but she'd apparently never accepted that failure. I photographed every page, then sat on the basement stairs processing what I'd found. For 40 years. Grace had been telling herself and her community that this mansion belonged to them or should belong to them. She'd built an entire narrative around a transaction that never happened, an acquisition that existed only in her imagination. The declaration of intent proved she knew the property wasn't community land. She'd tried to make it community land and failed. Everything since the ownership claims, the fake attorney letters, the harassment campaign was an attempt to achieve through pressure what she couldn't achieve through purchase. That evening, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Daniel Reeves, updating him on what I'd discovered and asking him to file a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office documenting Grace's pattern of fraud and harassment. The second was to the Oakwood Estates Community Board, not Grace, but the secretary whose contact information was listed on the HOA website. I requested time to address the membership at their next monthly meeting, citing important information regarding property boundaries and HOA jurisdiction. The secretary hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to grant access to someone Grace had painted as an adversary. I kept my voice calm and professional. I have documentation that affects every homeowner in this community. They deserve to see it. She scheduled me for Saturday at 10 in the morning. Grace would be there. So would every resident she'd deceived for nearly a decade. And so would the evidence that would finally expose the foundation of lies she'd built her authority upon. The trap was set. Now I just needed her to walk into it. Saturday morning arrived sharp and clear. The HOA Community Center had filled with 63 residents for what Grace had billed as an emergency session regarding unauthorized development. I arrived early with evidence and a portable projector. Grace was already positioned at the front like a general preparing for battle. She saw me enter, and her expression flickered surprise. Then something harder. She hadn't expected me to actually show up. Grace opened the meeting, commanding the room. An outsider has purchased the Whitfield property which belongs to all of us and is conducting unauthorized construction that violates our historical preservation standards. Today, we'll discuss legal options for protecting our community property. Murmurs rippled through the audience. They believed her. Why wouldn't they? She'd been telling this story long before I arrived. Mrs. Brown, I said, rising from the back row. You mentioned I'd have an opportunity to address the membership. Her smile turned rigid. 63 pairs of eyes were watching. She couldn't refuse. Of course. We believe in fairness here. I walked to the front and projected my first slide, the complete deed chain from 1892. Every transfer recorded, every sale is documented. No donation to any community organization. No transfer to Oakwood Estates HOA. And the second slide showed the 1985 subdivision plat. When this development was created, Lot 1 was specifically excluded from HOA jurisdiction. Parcel excluded from homeowner association governance. Public record. Anyone can verify it. People turned to look at Grace. Her knuckles had gone white. The third slide was her own declaration of intent from 1986. This proposal was drafted by Grace Whitfield Brown, maiden name Whitfield, outlining a plan for the HOA to purchase the property. The plan failed. The owners declined to sell. But this proves Mrs. Brown knew the mansion didn't belong to the HOA. She knew because she tried to change that and couldn't. Grace's composure was shattered. That document is private property. It was abandoned in the basement of a house I legally own, I said calmly. I turned back to the audience. For 40 years, Mrs. Brown has been telling this community that the Whitfield mansion belongs to you. She's sent cease and desist letters signed by an attorney who doesn't exist. Harold Westbrook, whose bar number returns no results in Virginia's database. She's been building a harassment campaign, trying to achieve through pressure what she couldn't achieve through purchase. It was my family's house. Grace's voice cracked. 3 generations of Whitfields lived there. The bank stole it from us. That property should never have been sold to strangers. She was trembling, decades of fury breaking through. I built this HOA. I've given 40 years to this community, and you're going to believe some outsider over everything I've done. A man in the third row stood navy suit, composed demeanor. Mrs. Brown, I'm Investigator Corey Alvarez with the Virginia State Attorney General's office. We've received a formal complaint regarding fraud, harassment, and filing false reports. The room went silent. I'm going to need you to come with me. You have the right to have an attorney present. Grace's face drained of color. She looked around at neighbors she'd led for 9 years and found no allies. Only shock. She didn't resist when Alvarez escorted her toward the door, but she stopped beside me, voice low. "You don't understand what you've taken from me." I met her gaze. "I didn't take anything. Mrs. Brown, I bought a house. You're the one who couldn't let go." She was gone before I could say anything else. I stayed for 2 hours, answering questions, showing documentation. By the time I left, the community understood exactly who had been lying to them. The confrontation was over. The consequences were just beginning. The charges came down 6 weeks later. Fraud for the fabricated attorney letter, harassment for the coordinated complaint campaign, filing false reports with county agencies. The state attorney general's office had built a thorough case. My documentation combined with records from Martin Cho's office showing years of anonymous complaints, all traceable to Grace's phone number and email. Her 40-year obsession had left a paper trail as damning as any confession. Grace accepted a plea deal rather than face trial. 2 years probation, $10,000 in fines, and a 15-year prohibition from holding any position in property management or community governance. The woman who'd built her identity around controlling Oakwood Estates would never control anything again. The HOA board issued a formal resolution acknowledging that Whitfield Manor had never been under their jurisdiction, a correction 40 years overdue. 3 board members who'd enabled Grace's campaign resigned quietly. The community elected new leadership with a mandate for transparency, though I suspected the real change would take longer than any election cycle. 8 months after Grace's arrest, I finished the restoration. The roof no longer leaked. The porch stood solid on new foundations built to match the 1892 originals. The stained glass in the parlor, cleaned and restored by a specialist from Richmond, caught afternoon light the way it must have when the Whitfield family first installed it. I'd spent nearly everything I had, but the house was alive again. That was always the point. I hosted an open house that October not to prove anything, but because buildings like this deserve to be seen. Neighbors who'd watched me with suspicion for a year walked through rooms they'd only imagined. The County Historical Preservation Office sent a representative who confirmed the restoration met National Register standards. Even Daniel Reeves came, examining the crown moldings with genuine appreciation. But the visitor who mattered most arrived near the end of the afternoon. Margaret Holloway was 78 years old, a lifelong Oakwood resident who'd known the original Whitfields. She moved slowly through the parlor, touching nothing, absorbing everything. When she reached me, she pressed something into my hands, a photograph, black and white, showing a family posed on the front porch in 1952. Parents, children, a grandmother in a wicker chair. The house behind them looked exactly as it did now. "They were good people," Margaret said quietly. "They lost everything in the recession, but they never stopped loving this place." She looked around the restored parlor. "Grace couldn't understand that preservation isn't the same as possession. You do." I framed the photograph and hung it in the front hallway, where every visitor would see it. The Whitfields had built this house. Grace had tried to reclaim it through lies. I had simply saved it the only thing it ever really needed. Some things can't be owned. They can only be protected. And sometimes, the deed that matters most isn't the one filed with the county. It's the work you do with your own hands, bringing something beautiful back from the edge of disappearing forever. The house stands. The truth stands with it. That's enough.